want them removed. So don't put any cosmetics on our system of oppression. We want to end oppression altogether. Neither is revenge acceptable to us in the BDS movement. We seek justice, not revenge. We do not seek a role exchange, whereby we become the stronger party and oppress our current oppressors. We want to end oppression against everyone. We don't want to reverse roles. So justice, not revenge, is a key point in our philosophy. And of course, we're very proud of Jewish-Israeli support for the BDS movement, which is a phenomenon that started having impact since 2009, since Israel's attack on Gaza. Boycott from Within, which is a group, hundreds of Jewish-Israeli activists, academics, students, LGBT activists, feminists, and so on. The Coalition of Women for Peace, which produces an excellent website called Who Profits. It's a database of companies that are complicit in Israel's occupation specifically. WhoProfits.org, if anyone wants to check out that website. It's an excellent resource for boycott activists worldwide. ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, are just 3 examples of Israeli groups, predominantly Jewish Israeli groups, that have supported the BDS movement, and we're very proud of their help. Boycott from Within specifically has been instrumental in several cultural boycott successes that we've had over the last couple of years. So the BDS movement is very much inspired by Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, by Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in this country, and certainly by Gandhi and Gandhi's philosophy. But above and beyond all that, it's an authentic, rooted, contemporary, nonviolent Palestinian resistance movement. It's a very Palestinian form of resistance. We did not learn nonviolence from Gandhi, Mandela, or Martin Luther King, with all due respect to all 3. We've had nonviolent popular resistance within our heritage of resistance for decades against the British Mandate and the onslaught of settler colonialism onto resisting ethnic cleansing and occupation. As far back as 1933 in Jaffa, against the British Mandate, Palestinians held predominantly nonviolent forms of resistance, strikes, boycotts, and other forms of popular resistance. On to the first Intifada, which started in 1987, which was a popular resistance that spread throughout the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. To cultural resistance, literary resistance, like expressed by Mahmoud Darwish, the late Mahmoud Darwish, the famous Palestinian poet. To dance as resistance, and this is a picture from one of my dances, actually. To education as resistance, because Israel systematically inhibits Palestinian education. Just an example, during the first Intifada, Israel shut down all Palestinian universities, and then shut down all Palestinian schools, and then all Palestinian kindergartens. Effectively, Palestinian education was criminalized, and a Palestinian child holding a book could be arrested and the book confiscated. There was a specific military order to that effect, and if anyone needs the resource, I can send them that. There's a lot of research about suppression of education. We did not hear many liberal academics then, in 1988, complain about Israel's closure of all Palestinian universities, in Birzeit University's case, for 4 consecutive years. Imagine shutting down a university for 4 consecutive years. So learning became a form of resistance. This specific example is a curfew in Hebron, where Palestinian schoolgirls were not allowed to go to school. And they insisted and had their class at the checkpoint, at the military checkpoint. Ultimately, they were tear gassed and had to disperse. But every single day, they came back and tried to have their class at the checkpoint in order to get to school. And of course, in 1987, demonstrations by academics and students, like this one by Birzeit University, academic staff and students, against the closure. All this form of Palestinian popular resistance was a preamble to the Arab Spring. That's a very important factor that people miss in this country due to lack of coverage in the mainstream media. Leaders of the Arab Spring say how the Palestinian popular resistance has always inspired them. And in turn, the Arab Spring inspired the Occupy movement in this country, like Occupy Wall Street. And we look at this movement as a very important development in the world, because we see ourselves as part of the movement, global movement for social justice dignity, and equality for all human beings. So when the Occupy Wall Street started, some Palestinians demonstrated carrying the sign, "Occupy Wall Street, not Palestine, boycott Israel." So we talked about peace with justice, but what about balance? A very commonly used term in this country. Yes, we know occupation and so on, but we want to be balanced. We want to address both sides. Nelson Mandela warned, cautioned against easily being enticed to read reconciliation and fairness as meaning parity between justice and injustice. And in Mandela's view, this is totally immoral to see any parity between justice and injustice, because there is no parity. There is no symmetry between justice and injustice. So somebody saying, I support Israel, but I'm against the occupation. What does that mean? Who's doing the occupation? If you're supporting Israel, how can you be against the occupation? If you're opposed to the occupation, then you're opposed to Israeli policies and Israeli laws. So you should take a stand against Israel. There's no other meaning. The occupation is not an entity that exists independently of the state of Israel. It is the state of Israel that's committing the occupation, building settlements, and so on and so forth. Let's get that. So BDS has various forms: economic, cultural, academic, and I'll talk about them as much as I can within the given time frame. Economic boycott. The main objective of the economic boycott, that aspect of BDS, is making corporate complicity costly. Until before the BDS movement was established in 2005, corporations that were complicit in Israel's occupation, building settlements, or other crimes got off the hook easily. There was no price to pay. You can be Caterpillar or any other company, sell weapons to Israel or sell bulldozers that are used as weapons and know exactly that they're being used to suppress human rights, and you get away with it. With the BDS movement, there's more accountability. Finally, corporations are starting to feel the heat of popular pressure against them to hold them accountable to social responsibility, ethical responsibility. We'll see some examples. The government of Norway, which has one of the largest pension funds, sovereign funds in the world, some 600 billion plus pension fund, we had a campaign by Palestinian BDS groups like Stop the Wall, by the Israeli Coalition of Women for Peace, the Who Prophets, together, and Adala New York, a BDS group in New York, together we lobbied the Norwegian pension fund until they divested from several Israeli companies over a period of 2 years, including Elbit Systems, a military company, and Africa Israel, a holding company that controls real estate and other operations, because of their involvement in the occupation specifically. Veolia, a French company involved in the Jerusalem light trade, which is a tram connecting Israel's illegal settlements in and around occupied Jerusalem with the city of Jerusalem. Because of its involvement in this illegal project, the BDS movement targeted Veolia since November 2008. Until now, Veolia lost contracts worth more than $16 billion, mainly due to BDS activism in Sweden, in the UK, in Ireland, and elsewhere. But BDS is about context, sensitivity, and sustainability. So it's not a centralized, hierarchical movement. It's built on the creativity and innovation of activists and activist groups everywhere. So an example of this is Code Pink, the anti-war movement here in this country, maybe a feminist movement, started a campaign against Ahava, a cosmetics company manufacturing mainly in a settlement in the occupied territories. Code Pink targeted Ahava and are doing an excellent job chasing Ahava out of stores the world over, from London to Australia to Japan to South Africa to many other countries. So even targeting one product that's involved, one company that's involved in violations of human rights is very effective. BDS is not one size that fits all. You don't apply the same tactics everywhere. You've got to tailor your tactics according to the context that you're active within. In the trade unions around the world, the support has been massive. CUSATU, the South African trade union, was the first, obviously, to support BDS, but also the Trades Union Congress of Great Britain supported aspects of BDS. HUT, the Brazilian Trade Union Federation, with 22 million members, endorsed BDS. The Irish Congress, the Scottish, some trade unions in France, in Spain, and so on and so forth. Canada, of course. The most recent trade union success for the BDS movement was the Public Services International, the PSI, which represents 20 million workers in some 150 countries. In November 2012, in its international conference in Durban, South Africa, PSI adopted BDS. One aspect of the BDS movement is the cultural and academic boycott, perhaps the least understood of the entire BDS movement. Why is that? Because in this country, when you talk about academic and cultural boycott, immediately the response is, oh, you want to boycott academics? How dare you? You're coming to a university where academic freedom is so respected, and you talk about boycotting academics? Well, who's talking about boycotting academics? The Palestinian campaign certainly has never called for boycotting academics or cultural workers. It calls for boycotting academic and cultural institutions. And there's a huge difference. In the South African case, in comparison, the boycott was blanket against everyone South African. People forget that. Those of you who supported the academic boycott in the South African case supported a boycott of every single South African academic. In the Palestinian case, we have not done that. We've adopted a more nuanced, targeted approach, targeting institutions specifically over their complicity in Israel's violations of human rights and international law. What does that mean practically? It means if a professor, an Israeli professor, is invited by QC Irvine to give a lecture here, there's nothing in the PACB guidelines, the academic and cultural boycott guidelines, to prevent her from coming to UC Irvine and teaching. We don't target this. Publishing papers together and so on, there's nothing to prevent that. What we're targeting, what we were calling for a boycott of, are institutional links, exchange programs, any type of institutional link between two universities, two academic institutions, not individual academics working together, and there's a huge difference. Israeli Apartheid Week is the most important campus-based BDS campaign that happens every year. Last year it was held at more than 200 campuses worldwide. Remember that this started in 2005 at the University of Toronto in Canada alone. So 7 years ago, Israeli Apartheid Week was held at one university, and 7 years later, it was held at 200 universities. Israel is so alarmed at the growth of Israeli Apartheid Week that last year, the Israeli Foreign Ministry sent 100 emissaries around the world to counter Israeli Apartheid Week. This was widely reported in the Israeli media. One important success for the academic boycott campaign is the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, obviously, again, at the forefront of the boycott. The University of Johannesburg boycotted Ben Gurion University in the Naqab, in the Negev, in March 2011, after a long campaign led by the likes of Archbishop Desmond Tutu and leading academics, including presidents of universities in South Africa. It was a massive campaign. Hundreds of the top academics in South Africa supported that campaign. But also the cultural boycott is extremely important. In fact, this is one of the fastest growing aspects of BDS. Gil Scott-Heron, Costello, the Pixies, Ken Loach, Vanessa Paradis, even Snoop Dogg, and many, many, many others have either canceled performances in Israel or refused to schedule performances in Israel. Some of them, like Ken Loach, advocates BDS quite openly. Many Jewish academics and cultural figures have also boycotted Israel, like Mike Lee, one of the most famous Jewish British filmmakers, canceled an appearance in Tel Aviv and explained exactly why in an interview with the Jewish Chronicle in the UK. Roger Waters of Pink Floyd says, I'm against Israel for exactly the same reasons that I was against South Africa. It's a two-tiered racist system. I'm calling on my fellow musicians and artists to join the BDS campaign against Israel. Enough is enough. Well, who cares what Roger Waters says? Well, this guy has millions of fans. Until now, he performs in Los Angeles or New York and attracts 50,000, 40,000 audience. So when Roger Waters adopts BDS, his fans, whom we can never reach without him, I mean, we don't usually reach rock fans easily, you must admit, we can reach through Roger Waters. So it's very important when cultural figures, cultural icons like him adopt BDS, because the message propagates, the message reaches many more people. Stevie Wonder, in November of last year, was scheduled to perform at an LA benefit concert for the Israeli army. After a lot of public pressure, including from civil rights leaders, African-American leaders in this country, from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, from Roger Waters, and many, many, many more, including the UN, Stevie Wonder ultimately canceled his benefit gig for the IDF. Cassandra Wilson, the famous American jazz singer, said, "As a human rights activist, I identify with the cultural boycott of Israel." She canceled the performance after we approached her. By we, I mean the movement, which means our Israeli partners, we, our European partners, our American partners, and so on. Cat Power also canceled a performance in Israel after being approached by the cultural boycott campaigns around the world. And as reported in the Huffington Post, she canceled Israel's show over conflict with the Palestinians. And never mind the typo, Huffington Post, what do you expect? They don't know how to spell Palestinians. So increasingly, Tel Aviv started looking like Sun City, the resort in South Africa that the South African apartheid government tried to circumvent the cultural boycott through. Increasingly, artists started shunning Tel Aviv like they used to shun Sun City in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Major cultural figures in the US have come out in support of BDS, like Alice Walker, the author of Color Purple and several prize winner, who said, Alice Walker said, Rosa Parks would have supported BDS to soothe the pain and attend the sorrows of a people wrongly treated for generations. Recently, in an interview with Amy Goodman, Alice Walker said, the situation in Palestine is even worse than the South, 50 years ago. It's even worse than the Jim Crow South. And this is for someone who lived the Jim Crow South. Judith Butler, the famous Jewish American philosopher and academic, said BDS is the only way that citizens can call for the enforcement of international law. Angela Davis said, it's not the image of the Israeli government that needs changing, but rather its racist and repressive policies and practices of apartheid. Naomi Klein had a different take on BDS. When she came out in 2009 supporting BDS, she said, boycott is not a dogma, it's a tactic. The reason the strategy should be tried is practical. In a country so small and trade dependent as Israel, it could actually work. What is Naomi Klein talking about? Of course, Naomi Klein is a world bestseller, Jewish Canadian author. Because she was asked, why not boycott the United States? Why are you calling for boycotting Israel? The United States is the biggest supporter of Israel, so why aren't you calling for a boycott of the United States? And Naomi Klein had a very pragmatic answer. A boycott of the United States cannot possibly work, not in the current situation. The US government is extremely powerful, the US economy is extremely powerful, even though the US government is extremely supportive of Israel, it cannot be a target of boycott if we're really practical and want to achieve results. Naomi Klein is saying, whereas Israel is extremely dependent, so you can hold it accountable to its human rights violations in an effective way. So boycott is not just symbolic, it's not just a gesture, it's actually effective in the Israeli case. BDS in the United States, several partners, including the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation, I mentioned Code Pink, Adala New York, and many, many, many groups on US campuses have developed that have started BDS campaigns. I'll just give a quick reminder of them. After the flotilla attack, 2010, when Israel attacked the Mavi Marmara, the humanitarian ship that was going to break the siege on Gaza, Oakland dock workers heeded a Palestinian call for boycotting Israeli ships. They boycotted an Israeli ship in Oakland for 24 hours. Yes, very short period, but a historic 24 hours. Dock workers in Sweden boycotted Israeli ships for days, I think 8 days it was, in Cochin, the fourth largest port in India, in Turkey, in South Africa. So there started a boycott of Israeli ships. Besiege your siege is the slogan that we used at the time. Jewish groups in the United States and their support for BDS. As I said earlier, we're extremely proud of the support we have from Jewish groups, not only in Israel, but also in the United States, the UK, France, and everywhere. Jewish Voice for Peace, which has not yet officially endorsed BDS, by the way, is leading with its partners one of the most important BDS campaigns in the US to date. That's the campaign against TIAA-CREF, the large pension fund, which served